The room was sterile, yet suffocating. The bright fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, creating an atmosphere more oppressive than clinical. She lay on the hospital bed, her newborn son wrapped in a thin blanket, resting in her arms. Her heart was heavy with a mix of exhaustion and joy, but it was a fleeting feeling, one that would be shattered in moments. The doctor stood by the bedside, his white coat pristine, his eyes cold. His tone was calm, almost casual, but the words that came out of his mouth were sharper than broken glass. "You do realize," he said, his lips curling into a faint, condescending smirk, "that this child would have a much better chance at life if he weren't limited by his circumstances." He glanced at the newborn, his expression unreadable, before meeting her eyes. "A boy like him deserves an opportunity, one I'm afraid you can't provide." Her throat tightened as if she'd swallowed a stone. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the blatant cruelty disguised as professional advice. She forced herself to respond, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, holding her baby closer to her chest as though shielding him from the venomous words. The doctor didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed emboldened by her reaction, as if her pain and confusion validated his superiority. "I'm saying," he continued, his tone cool and detached, "that families like yours often struggle to provide the opportunities a child needs to thrive. A placement program could ensure he grows up in an environment that nurtures his full potential. It's what's best for the child." Her vision blurred with tears, but her anger burned through the haze. "Families like mine," she snapped, her voice cracking. "You mean black families?" He didn't deny it. Instead, he folded his arms, his expression firm, as though he were the arbiter of morality. "This isn't about race," he said, but the venom in his tone betrayed him. "It's about ensuring the child has every advantage in life. Your situation, your limitations, don't provide that." The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as her pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to scream, to demand how he could stand there and strip her of her dignity as if she were unfit to be a mother. But before she could say another word, he took a step closer, his voice lowering to an icy whisper. "You need to think carefully about what's best for him," he said. "Sometimes, letting go is the kindest thing you can do." Her grip on her baby tightened as the doctor's hand reached out, not toward her, but toward the infant. That's when it hit her. He wasn't just speaking hypothetically. He was trying to take her child. Her body froze in a moment of pure terror before her instincts kicked in. She turned her body away, clutching her son protectively. "You're not taking him," she screamed, her voice filled with desperation and defiance. The doctor straightened, his composure unshaken. "I suggest you calm down," he said with a chilling air of authority. "Raising your voice isn't going to change the facts. And the fact is, this isn't your decision to make anymore." Her mind spun, panic and fury colliding as she realized how helpless she was in this moment. He had the power. He had the authority. And he had no intention of leaving without her son. The door creaked open behind him, and for a fleeting second, she thought it was a nurse or hospital staff who might intervene. But when she saw who entered, the tears in her eyes turned into something else entirely. It was her husband. And in that instant, everything changed. She saw the way his jaw clenched as he took in the scene, his sharp eyes scanning the room, locking onto the doctor's hand hovering too close to their child. There was a quiet storm brewing in him, a fierce, unrelenting energy that filled the space in an instant. He didn't say a word at first, but the shift in the air was palpable. Even the doctor, with all his arrogance and entitlement, took a hesitant step back, his confidence faltering as the realization set in. Her husband's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but razor-sharp, slicing through the tension with chilling precision. "What exactly is going on here?" The doctor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as if he'd been caught in a spotlight he didn't anticipate. The woman didn't hesitate. Her voice, still trembling but now fueled by a newfound strength, rang out. He tried to take our son. He said we weren't fit to raise him. Her husband's eyes darkened, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice as he addressed the doctor. You thought you could decide that, did you? The doctor stumbled over his words, trying to regain control of the situation. I was only acting in the child's best interest. This isn't personal. But it was too late. The man standing before him wasn't just a husband or a father. He was an FBI agent, one who wasn't about to let this slide. What followed was a series of events no one in that hospital could have anticipated. The doctor's cold confidence crumbled as the tables turned in ways that would leave everyone in the room, and the audience, stunned. How did a moment of blatant racism and cruelty spiral into a life-altering confrontation that would expose secrets, dismantle reputations, and deliver a justice no one saw coming? Stay with us to find out. This is a story of love, resilience, and the kind of karma that doesn't just strike, it devastates. Hello, dear viewers. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black audience. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. Your voice, your experience, and your humanity matter deeply. This story is a reminder of the strength, resilience, and justice that triumphs in the face of adversity. We hope it resonates with you and brings a powerful sense of vindication. If you enjoy the twists and turns in our stories, please support our channel by hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications. Your support means everything to us. Now, sit back and get ready for an unforgettable tale. Thank you for being here. Let's jump in. The crisp autumn air carried a faint chill, seeping through the slightly cracked windows of the modest family car as it pulled into the parking lot of St. Mark's Medical Center. Inside, Nina adjusted the scarf around her neck and placed a reassuring hand on her pregnant belly. Her dark brown eyes reflected a mixture of exhaustion and determination. It had been a long pregnancy, marked by small victories and quiet struggles. Nina was a woman who radiated strength in her every movement, the kind of person who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders with grace and unwavering resolve. Her deep brown skin glowed, even in the soft morning light, and her tightly coiled hair framed her face like a crown. She was beautiful, but more importantly, she was resilient. Sitting beside her in the driver's seat was her husband, Marcus. Tall and broad-shouldered, he had the kind of presence that demanded attention without effort. His dark skin seemed to absorb the sunlight and his sharp, alert eyes hinted at a lifetime of observing more than he spoke. Marcus worked for the FBI, a career he had built with grit, intelligence, and a relentless commitment to justice. He had seen the worst the world had to offer, but he found solace in his family, especially Nina. They were his anchor, his reason for enduring the chaos of his job. His protective nature ran deep, and the thought of anything threatening his wife or their soon-to-be-born child was enough to awaken a quiet but formidable storm within him. The hospital itself was a towering structure of concrete and glass, a place that symbolized both hope and dread for its visitors. Inside, it was sterile and unwelcoming, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the polished floors and neutral walls. The maternity wing was tucked away on the third floor, bustling with the rhythms of new life and the quiet hum of anticipation. It was here that Nina and Marcus had come, filled with the excitement and trepidation that accompanies the birth of a first child. They had chosen St. Mark's for its reputation, believing it was the best place to welcome their baby into the world. But they didn't know that beneath the hospital's polished surface lay cracks that would soon reveal a much darker reality. As they approached the reception desk, Nina leaned on Marcus for support. The receptionist, a young woman with a polite but detached demeanor, checked them in quickly. Nina's contractions had started hours ago, and though the pain was manageable, it was clear that the baby would not wait much longer. Marcus's hand never left her back, his quiet reassurance a steady presence as they were guided to a private room. The nurse, an older woman named Harriet, was kind and efficient, her warm smile a small comfort amidst the unfamiliar surroundings. She explained the process, adjusted Nina's monitors, and promised that everything was going smoothly. Marcus watched every movement, his trained eyes noticing details others might overlook, but for now, everything seemed routine. Hours passed, marked by the steady beeping of monitors and the low murmur of voices in the hallway. Nina's labor progressed steadily, and by early evening, the room was filled with the cries of a healthy baby boy. The nurse placed the newborn in Nina's arms, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The weight of the child in her arms, the softness of his skin, the way his tiny fingers curled instinctively around hers, it was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. Marcus stood beside her, his usually stoic face softening as he looked at his son for the first time. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to Nina's forehead and whispering words of love and pride. But not everyone in the room shared their joy. Standing a few steps away, the attending physician, Dr. Leonard Whitaker, observed the scene with an expression that was harder to read. Tall and impeccably dressed, Whitaker was a man who prided himself on his professionalism and expertise. His neatly trimmed silver hair and sharp features gave him an air of authority, one he wielded with a subtle but unmistakable arrogance. Whitaker had spent decades building his reputation as one of the best obstetricians in the city, but there was something cold about him, something that set him apart from the warmth and compassion typically associated with his profession. As the hours passed and the initial excitement settled, Marcus stepped out to make a quick call, leaving Nina alone in the room with their baby. It was then that Whitaker returned, his demeanor even more distant than before. He approached Nina's bedside, his hands tucked neatly into the pockets of his white coat, and began speaking in a tone that was both calm and unsettlingly clinical. His words were careful, measured, but they carried an undercurrent of something Nina couldn't quite place, a quiet disdain that seemed to seep into every syllable. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a byproduct of exhaustion and the emotional whirlwind of the day. But as he continued, it became clear that his words were not merely detached, they were cutting. Whitaker spoke of statistics and probabilities, of opportunities and potential, framing his arguments with a thin veneer of concern. He mentioned programs and placements, using language that was deliberately vague yet pointed. Nina's initial confusion turned to disbelief as she realized the implication of his words. He wasn't just offering advice or guidance. He was suggesting that her child would be better off without her. The shock of his audacity left her momentarily speechless, her mind racing to process the enormity of what was happening. When she finally found her voice, it was shaky but firm. She demanded to know what he meant, her protective instincts flaring as she clutched her son closer. Whitaker's response was dismissive, his tone growing sharper as he spoke of objective truths and difficult decisions. He didn't raise his voice, but his words were laced with a quiet cruelty that cut deeper than any shout could have. Nina felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she also felt a pang of fear. She was alone in that room, vulnerable and exhausted, with only her instincts to guide her. The tension in the room was palpable when Marcus returned. He stepped in just as Whitaker's hand reached out, his intention clear. The sight of his wife, her face a mix of fear and defiance, and the doctor's hand hovering too close to their child ignited something in him. Marcus didn't need to hear the whole conversation to understand what was happening. His instincts as a husband, a father, and an agent of justice kicked in, and in that moment, everything changed. What began as a joyous occasion had turned into a confrontation that would unravel truths no one could have predicted. The calm professionalism of Dr. Whitaker was about to be stripped away, exposing a much darker side to the man who had spent years hiding behind a mask of respectability. And as Marcus stood there, his presence filling the room with a quiet but undeniable power, one question lingered: how far would a father go to protect his family? The answer, as they would all soon learn, was farther than anyone could imagine. The air in the hospital room had shifted, thickening with an unspoken tension that Nina couldn't shake. Marcus, now fully aware that something was deeply wrong, stood tall near the door, his broad frame cutting an imposing figure against the sterile white walls. His dark eyes locked onto Dr. Whitaker's as if searching for the truth buried beneath the man's practiced calm. The doctor adjusted his pristine white coat, his composure seemingly intact, but the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed his discomfort under Marcus's intense gaze. Nina sat upright in the hospital bed, cradling her newborn son tightly. Her exhaustion was palpable, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than her fatigue. She wasn't going to let her guard down, not now, not ever. Marcus broke the silence first, his voice low and measured, every word dripping with an authority that demanded answers. "What exactly were you doing, doctor? Because from where I'm standing, it looked like you were about to cross a line you had no business crossing." Whitaker raised a hand, his tone shifting to one of forced politeness, though it was clear he was already recalibrating his strategy. "Mr. Bennett, I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding. My only concern is for the well-being of this child. As a medical professional, it's my responsibility to ensure every patient receives the care and opportunity they deserve." Marcus took a step closer, his expression hardening. "And you think taking a child from his mother is part of that responsibility? Explain to me how that works." Nina, her voice firm despite the quiver of emotion threatening to break through, interjected. "He didn't even try to hide it, Marcus. He looked me in the eye and told me my baby would be better off without me. Without us." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she straightened her back, refusing to let her vulnerability diminish her resolve. Whitaker, sensing he was losing control of the narrative, adjusted his stance and adopted a tone of detached professionalism. "Mrs. Bennett, please try to understand. These conversations can be difficult, but they are necessary. This isn't personal. It's about providing the best possible future for your son. In some cases, that means considering alternatives." Marcus's voice cut through like a blade. "Don't you dare talk about what's best for my son as if you have any idea what that means. You don't know us, and you sure as hell don't get to make decisions for my family." The room fell into a heavy silence, each word hanging in the air like an unresolved chord. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably, his hands finding refuge in his coat pockets. For the first time, his polished demeanor cracked ever so slightly. "Mr. Bennett," he began cautiously, "I understand your perspective, but I need you to see this from mine. My experience in this field spans decades. I've seen situations where, despite the parent's best intentions, the child's potential is limited by circumstances beyond their control." Nina's frustration boiled over, her voice sharp and filled with pain. "Circumstances like what? Like being born to a black mother? Like not growing up in one of your picture-perfect families? Just say it, doctor. You think we're not good enough?" Whitaker's face tightened, but he didn't deny it. His silence spoke louder than any words could, and the weight of his unspoken judgment settled heavily in the room. Marcus stepped forward again, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Let me make one thing very clear. You will not touch my son. You will not decide his future, and you will not decide what kind of parents we are. Whatever you thought you could do here, it ends now." Whitaker straightened his posture, clearly weighing his options. He glanced at Nina, then back at Marcus, his eyes narrowing as if calculating his next move. "I see you're both very passionate," he said, his tone now laced with an almost imperceptible condescension. "But passion alone doesn't guarantee a child's success. If you're unwilling to have a rational conversation about this, then I have no choice but to escalate the matter." Nina's heart raced. "Escalate? What does that even mean? You've already gone too far." Whitaker gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind that carried no warmth. "It means there are procedures in place to handle situations like this. If I have reason to believe a child's well-being is at risk, I am obligated to report it to the appropriate authorities." Marcus's jaw clenched, the storm inside him threatening to break loose. "You want to report us? Go ahead. But before you do, you might want to think about who you're dealing with." The doctor raised an eyebrow, his confidence flickering as he noticed the barely concealed fury in Marcus's eyes. "And who exactly would that be?" Whitaker asked, his attempt at feigned indifference falling flat. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out his badge with a deliberate slowness that sent a clear message. He held it up, his voice steady and unyielding. "Special Agent Marcus Bennett, FBI. And right now, you're about one step away from having to answer some very uncomfortable questions about what you've been doing in this hospital." Whitaker's face drained of color. For the first time, his carefully constructed mask of authority slipped, revealing the fear and uncertainty beneath. He took a small step back, his hands briefly twitching at his sides before he forced them still. "Agent Bennett," he said, his voice faltering. "I'm sure we can resolve this matter without unnecessary complications." Marcus didn't flinch. "Oh, there are going to be complications, all right. Starting with you explaining why you think you can play God with people's lives." The tension in the room was electric, crackling with unspoken threats and the weight of everything left unsaid. Nina watched the exchange, her breath shallow but steady. She could feel the tide turning, but the battle was far from over. Whitaker, though visibly shaken, wasn't the type to back down easily. He had built his career on confidence and control, and surrendering wasn't in his nature. As the moments stretched into an uneasy silence, Marcus turned to Nina, his expression softening as he addressed her. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you or the baby?" Nina shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No. But he tried. Marcus, he tried to take our son." Marcus's eyes darkened, the fire in them reigniting as he turned back to Whitaker. "You're done here. And when this is over, I'll make sure you never get to do this to anyone else again." Whitaker's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. The room had shifted again, the balance of power tipping firmly in Marcus and Nina's favor. But even as Whitaker backed away, retreating to regroup, the unease in the air remained. Marcus and Nina both knew this wasn't the end, only the beginning of a much larger fight. And as they prepared to face whatever came next, one question loomed in the back of their minds: what would Whitaker do now that his plans had been exposed? The answer, they feared, would be far more sinister than they could imagine. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of the hospital room, casting long shadows across the sterile walls. Nina sat upright in her bed, her newborn son nestled against her chest. Marcus stood by the window, his arms crossed as he stared out at the parking lot below, his sharp mind piecing together the events of the night before. The air between them was heavy, charged with a tension neither had fully voiced yet. They both knew Whitaker wasn't done. The doctor had left the room last night with his authority bruised but not broken, and someone like him didn't take well to being challenged. A knock at the door interrupted their thoughts. Harriet, the nurse who had been kind to Nina since their arrival, stepped in with a cautious smile. But something about her demeanor seemed off, her usual warmth was clouded by unease. She closed the door behind her, glancing nervously at Marcus before speaking. "I thought you should know," she began, her voice low and hesitant. "Dr. Whitaker has been asking questions. About you. About your family. He's not happy, and I think he's planning something." Nina felt her chest tighten, her arms instinctively pulling her baby closer. "Planning what?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay calm. Harriet hesitated, her eyes darting between the couple. "I don't know exactly. But he's been in his office all morning, making calls, going through files. It's not normal, even for him." Marcus turned away from the window, his expression hardening. "Where's his office?" Harriet's eyes widened slightly. "Third floor, end of the east wing." "But Agent Bennett, please, if you confront him now, it might escalate things." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Thank you for telling us. You did the right thing." Harriet lingered for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more, then nodded and left the room. Marcus turned to Nina, his voice steady but laced with urgency. I need to find out what he's doing. Nina's eyes filled with worry. Marcus, be careful. You saw how far he was willing to go. If he feels cornered, I know, Marcus interrupted gently. But I'm not going to let him hurt our family. Stay here with the baby. I'll handle this. Nina nodded reluctantly, her fear for Marcus warring with her trust in him. As he left the room, the quiet click of the door closing behind him seemed to echo louder than it should have. She held her son close, whispering a silent prayer for strength, for both of them. Marcus moved through the hospital with purpose, his polished shoes striking the floor in a rhythm that matched the steady beat of his heart. When he reached Whitaker's office, the door was closed. He knocked once, sharply, and waited. No response. He knocked again, this time louder. Still nothing. Taking a deep breath, he tried the handle. It was locked. His FBI training kicked in, the calm, methodical part of his mind taking over. He scanned the hallway, noting the security cameras and the absence of staff nearby. Pulling out a small tool from his pocket, a habit he'd carried from years of undercover work, he manipulated the lock until it clicked open. Slipping inside, he closed the door behind him and surveyed the room. Whitaker's office was meticulously organized, every book, file, and paper in its place. But the desk was another story. Papers were scattered across the surface, some of them bearing names and details Marcus didn't recognize. He sifted through them quickly, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the narrative they told. Whitaker wasn't just targeting his family, he had a pattern. Case after case of children taken from parents under questionable circumstances, all under the guise of medical necessity. Marcus's stomach churned as he realized the full scope of what the doctor had been doing. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled him from his thoughts. He quickly gathered the most incriminating documents and slipped them into his jacket pocket, then moved to the corner of the room, where he could stay out of sight. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. The handle turned, and Whitaker stepped in. The doctor froze when he saw Marcus standing there, his eyes widening in shock before narrowing in anger. "Agent Bennett," he said coldly. "I wasn't expecting you." Marcus didn't move, his stance calm but intimidating. "Clearly. I wanted to see what you've been up to, and I have to say, I'm not surprised." Whitaker closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate. "You have no right to be here. This is my office. And you have no right to take children from their families," Marcus countered, his voice steady but seething with controlled anger. "I know what you've been doing, Whitaker. This isn't about medical ethics or the child's best interest. This is about power. Your power. And you've been abusing it for years." Whitaker's composure cracked, his face flushing with anger. "You don't understand the complexities of my work. Do you think every family is equipped to raise a child properly? Do you think I enjoy making these decisions? I'm doing what's necessary, what others won't." Marcus took a step forward, his presence towering over the doctor. "You're not a savior. You're a predator, hiding behind your title and your privilege. But that ends today." Whitaker's eyes darted to the desk, as if considering his next move. "You have no proof. Whatever you think you found won't hold up." Marcus smirked, his confidence unshaken. "You'd be surprised what holds up in court, especially when the evidence comes from your own files." Whitaker's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Do you really want to go down this path, Agent Bennett? You have a family to protect. Are you sure you want to make me your enemy?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "You already made that choice when you tried to take my son." For a moment, neither man moved, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Whitaker's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and Marcus could see the fear creeping into his eyes. But fear wasn't enough. Marcus needed to ensure Whitaker would never hurt another family again. As he stepped closer, Whitaker backed away, his confidence unraveling. The doctor's voice wavered as he tried to regain control. You think you can stop me? You don't understand how the system works. I have connections, resources you can't even imagine. Marcus's voice was quiet but unwavering. You may have connections, but I have the truth. And trust me, that's more powerful than you'll ever be. Whitaker's silence was deafening, his bluster finally extinguished. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone and recording the moment. Anything else you'd like to say? Because this will be the last time you get to speak freely before answering to the law. Whitaker's face turned pale, his carefully curated world crumbling around him. And for the first time, Marcus saw the man for what he truly was, a coward who had built his empire on the suffering of others, now exposed and powerless. As Marcus left the office, the weight of what had just transpired settled over him. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about every family Whitaker had harmed. And the justice that was coming would be swift, undeniable, and complete. As Marcus exited Whitaker's office, the documents in his jacket pocket felt heavier than they should have, as if the weight of the lives ruined by the doctor was pressing down on him. His mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and the steps he needed to take next. But as much as he wanted to focus on justice, his heart pulled him back to Nina and their son. They were his priority. He needed to make sure they were safe before the storm he was about to unleash fully took hold. The elevator ride back to the maternity ward was agonizingly slow. Each floor it passed seemed to stretch time, his pulse hammering in his ears. When the doors finally opened, the quiet hum of the maternity wing greeted him, but something felt off. The usual murmur of nurses and distant cries of newborns seemed quieter, almost muted. As he approached Nina's room, he saw Harriet standing outside the door, her face pale and drawn. "Agent Bennett," she said, her voice urgent but hushed. "You need to get inside. Now." Marcus didn't wait for an explanation. He pushed the door open to find Nina sitting on the edge of the bed, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. In her arms, she held their son tightly, her body positioned protectively around him. Across the room stood Whitaker, his face flushed with barely concealed rage, his hands clenched at his sides. "What the hell are you doing here?" Marcus demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Whitaker turned to face him, his composure unraveling further with every second. "You think you can intimidate me?" he spat, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "You think you can ruin my career, my life, without consequences? I won't let you destroy everything I've built." Marcus stepped between Whitaker and his family, his body a shield as he glared at the doctor. "Everything you've built is a house of cards, and it's about to come crashing down. You broke the law, you abused your power, and you hurt countless families. Did you really think you'd get away with it forever?" Whitaker's lips curled into a sneer. "You're no different from the others," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You walk in here, acting like you know better, like you have some moral high ground. But you don't understand the sacrifices I've made, the decisions I've had to live with. I've saved more lives than you can imagine." Nina's voice, steady but filled with emotion, cut through the air. "And how many lives have you destroyed in the process? How many mothers have you taken their children from, telling yourself it was for their own good? You don't save lives, Dr. Whitaker. You steal them." Whitaker's face contorted with anger, his control slipping further. "You're not fit to judge me," he snapped. "Neither of you. You think you're better than the system? That you're above the rules?" Marcus took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "The only one breaking the rules here is you. And trust me, you're going to answer for every single one of them." Whitaker's eyes darted around the room, searching for some way to regain control, but there was no escape. He was cornered, and he knew it. Yet instead of surrendering, he doubled down, his voice rising with desperation. "You don't get it. You're putting your family at risk by coming after me. Do you really think the people I work with will let this slide? You'll lose everything. Marcus's expression didn't waver. The difference between us, Whitaker, is that I don't hide behind threats and connections. I face the truth head-on. And the truth is, you're nothing more than a coward. Whitaker's hand twitched, his frustration boiling over. You think you can just walk away from this? That your badge will protect you? You're naive if you think the system is on your side. Nina's voice rose, sharp and unwavering. The system isn't perfect, but at least my husband fights to make it better. You use it to destroy lives. That's the difference. Whitaker's face turned red, the weight of their words crashing over him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus cut him off. It's over, Whitaker. I've got enough evidence to bury you, and trust me, I will. So unless you want to spend the rest of your life in a prison cell, I suggest you start cooperating. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Whitaker stood frozen, his arrogance finally giving way to fear. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he processed the reality of his situation. He looked at Marcus, then at Nina, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see them, not as obstacles, but as people. His shoulders slumped, and the fight drained from his body. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus stepped forward, his tone firm but calm. "You're going to turn over every file, every record, every piece of evidence that ties you to what you've done. You're going to cooperate fully with the investigation, and you're going to make a statement admitting everything. If you try to run, if you try to hide anything, I will find you. Do you understand?" Whitaker nodded slowly, the weight of his defeat settling over him. "I understand," he said, his voice hollow. Marcus held his gaze for a moment longer before stepping back. "Then start talking." As Whitaker began to confess, the room seemed to grow lighter, as if the shadows that had loomed over them were finally starting to lift. Nina watched him closely, her grip on their son loosening slightly as relief began to take hold. But even as the doctor spoke, she knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much to uncover, so much to make right. When Whitaker finally left the room, escorted by hospital security, Marcus turned to Nina. He crossed the room in a few quick strides and knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her arm. "It's over," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "He can't hurt us anymore." Nina looked down at their son, then back at Marcus, her eyes filled with tears. "I know. But how many more families did he hurt before us? How many more are still out there, waiting for justice?" Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll find them. All of them. I promise." As the weight of the moment settled over them, Marcus and Nina knew their fight wasn't over. But for the first time, they felt the strength of hope, hope that justice would prevail, hope that the truth would come to light, and hope that no other family would have to endure what they had. And in that quiet hospital room, with their son safely in their arms, they knew they would face whatever came next together. The hospital hallways buzzed faintly with life as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the wide windows. Marcus and Nina sat together in the quiet of her room, the baby asleep in his bassinet beside them. The aftermath of Whitaker's confession lingered heavily in the air, an unspoken weight that neither of them had fully processed. For the first time in hours, there was a semblance of peace, but it was fragile, like glass that could shatter with a single wrong move. Marcus's gaze was fixed on the far wall, his mind still racing with the details of Whitaker's crimes, the files he had seen, and the implications of what came next. Nina reached over, placing a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You're thinking about the other families," she said softly, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. It wasn't a question, she knew him too well to need one. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "I can't stop thinking about them. The things I saw in those files. It's worse than I thought, Nina. He didn't just target us. There are dozens, maybe hundreds, of families he's done this to. And not just here. He's been moving around for years, hiding behind his reputation, using it to cover his tracks. Nina exhaled slowly, her expression a mix of anger and sorrow. And all those families, how many of them didn't have someone who could fight back? How many children did he take because their parents didn't know how to stop him? Her words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of why they couldn't stop now. Whitaker was just the tip of the iceberg, and if they didn't act, the damage he had caused would continue to fester in the shadows. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. "I've already called the bureau," he said after a moment. "They're opening an official investigation. Whitaker's files are going to be reviewed, and every single case is going to be scrutinized. He won't be able to weasel his way out of this." Nina watched him closely, the tension in his posture betraying the weight he was carrying. "But it's not just about him, is it?" she asked quietly. "You think there are others involved?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Someone like Whitaker doesn't operate alone. He's been in too many places, pulled off too many stunts. There's a network here, Nina. It's not just him. It's the people who covered for him, the ones who turned a blind eye, the ones who benefited from his decisions. This goes deeper than we thought." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and the enormity of what lay ahead. Nina broke it first, her voice steady but firm. "Then we fight. For our family. For the other families. For every mother who was told she wasn't good enough and every child who was stolen under the guise of what's best. We can't let them win." Marcus looked at her, the determination in her eyes igniting something in him. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "You're right. We fight. But we do it smart. Whitaker's confession is just the beginning. If we're going to take this all the way, we need to make sure every piece of evidence is airtight. No loopholes. No excuses." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Harriet stepped in cautiously, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I heard about what happened," she said quietly, her eyes flicking to the baby before meeting Nina's. "Are you both okay?" Nina offered a small, grateful smile. "We're okay. Thanks to Marcus." Harriet hesitated for a moment before stepping further into the room. "I wanted to let you know, some of the staff are talking. Whitaker has been here a long time, and not everyone is happy about what's happening. There are people who support him, who think he's being unfairly targeted." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "People who support a man who steals children?" Harriet nodded reluctantly. "They don't see it that way. To them, he's a hero. Someone who's done the hard work to save kids from bad situations. They believe his story because he's been so careful about how he presents himself. You've exposed him, but there are still people who are loyal to him, people who might try to protect him." The room fell into a tense silence as the implications of her words sank in. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with possibilities. "Do you know who these people are?" he asked, his tone sharp. Harriet shook her head. "Not exactly. But I've overheard conversations. People saying things like, Whitaker always knows what's best, or, he's being punished for doing the right thing. There's a culture here, Agent Bennett. It didn't start with him, and it won't end with him unless someone dismantles it." Marcus exchanged a look with Nina, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Whitaker's actions were part of a larger system, one that thrived on silence and complicity. Exposing him was just the beginning. Taking down the system would be an entirely different battle. "Thank you for telling us," Marcus said finally, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We'll handle it." Harriet nodded, her expression softening. "Be careful," she said before slipping out of the room. As the door closed behind her, Marcus turned back to Nina, his expression resolute. "We need to be ready. If there are people who still support Whitaker, they're going to push back. They'll try to discredit us, to protect him and the system that let him thrive. Nina nodded, her gaze steady. Let them try. They're not taking our family down. Not now. Not ever. The hours that followed were a blur of phone calls, strategy meetings, and moments of quiet reflection. Marcus worked tirelessly, coordinating with the FBI to ensure Whitaker's files were secured and the investigation was airtight. Nina focused on their son, her quiet strength reminder of why they were fighting. The hospital buzzed with activity, but beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. The cracks in Whitaker's carefully constructed facade had been exposed, and the system he represented was beginning to crumble. But the fight was far from over. As night fell, Marcus and Nina sat together by the window, their son sleeping peacefully in her arms. The city lights glittered in the distance, a stark contrast to the battles they were fighting behind closed doors. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew they weren't alone. They had each other, their son, and the truth on their side. And no matter what came next, they were ready to face it together. The stillness of the hospital room was deceptive, a quiet facade over the storm brewing just outside its walls. Marcus sat at the small table by the window, his laptop open and phone pressed to his ear. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as he sifted through files, organizing evidence that could blow Whitaker's entire operation wide open. Across the room, Nina cradled their son, her gentle humming filling the air with a fragile peace. But even in this moment of domestic calm, the tension in the air was palpable. Neither of them could ignore the weight of what had transpired, or what was yet to come. The call ended abruptly, and Marcus exhaled, his face drawn with the strain of the last 24 hours. Nina looked up, her eyes meeting his with quiet concern. "What did they say?" she asked softly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The Bureau is moving forward. They've secured the files I found in Whitaker's office, and they're launching a full investigation into his connections. But it's worse than we thought, Nina. The network Harriet mentioned. It's real. Whitaker wasn't acting alone. There are other doctors, social workers, even administrators in on it. People who've been profiting off this for years." Nina's grip on the baby tightened slightly as the enormity of his words sank in. "Profiting how?" she asked, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. Marcus shook his head, his jaw clenching. "Adoptions, mostly. They target vulnerable families, single mothers, parents struggling financially, people they think can't fight back. They pressure them into giving up their kids or outright fabricate reasons to take them away. And then they funnel those kids into private adoption agencies, making money off every placement. It's sick, Nina. They've been treating children like commodities." Nina's face hardened, her eyes darkening with a fury that mirrored his own. "And no one stopped them. No one thought to question what was happening." Marcus's expression was grim. "Some people did. There were reports, complaints, but the system protected them. Whitaker and his associates are good at covering their tracks, and when that didn't work, they used their influence to silence anyone who got too close." Nina shook her head, disbelief and rage warring within her. "It's monstrous. How do people like that sleep at night?" Marcus's gaze softened as he looked at her, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. "They convince themselves they're doing the right thing, that they're saving kids from bad situations. It's the same lie Whitaker tried to feed us. But deep down, they know what they're doing is wrong. They just don't care, as long as it benefits them." Nina was silent for a moment, her mind racing as she processed his words. Finally, she looked up, her expression fierce. "Then we have to make them care. We have to make sure they can't do this to anyone else." Marcus nodded, his determination mirroring hers. "We will. The Bureau's already building a case, but it's going to take time. These people are powerful, and they're not going to go down without a fight." As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, glancing at the screen before answering. "Bennett," he said curtly. The voice on the other end was familiar but tense. It was one of his colleagues at the bureau, an agent he trusted implicitly. "Marcus, we've got a problem," the agent said without preamble. "Whitaker's been talking. He's claiming you coerced him into confessing, that you fabricated evidence to go after him. He's trying to turn this around on you." Marcus's stomach sank, but his voice remained steady. "Of course he is. What else?" The agent hesitated before continuing. "There's more. Some of the people in his network are starting to push back. They're using their connections to discredit you and Nina, to paint you as overzealous and unfit parents. They're trying to muddy the waters, make it harder for us to build a case." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles white. "Let them try. We have the evidence. We have his confession." The agent sighed. "I know, but it's not that simple. These people are well connected, Marcus. They're going to make this as messy as possible." Marcus glanced at Nina, who was watching him intently, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. "Do what you need to do," he said finally. "I'll handle things on my end." After ending the call, Marcus sat in silence for a moment, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just heard. Nina broke the silence, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "They're going after us, aren't they?" Marcus nodded. "They're trying to discredit us, to make it look like we're the ones in the wrong. It's their way of protecting themselves." Nina's eyes narrowed, her resolve hardening. "Then we fight harder. They can't win, Marcus. Not this time." He reached out, taking her hand in his and squeezing it gently. "They won't. We've come too far to back down now." The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Marcus worked tirelessly, coordinating with the bureau and gathering every piece of evidence they had against Whitaker and his network. Nina reached out to Harriet, who had agreed to testify about what she'd seen and heard during her years at the hospital. Slowly but surely, the pieces of their case began to fall into place. But the pushback from Whitaker's supporters was relentless. False rumors began to circulate, whispers of misconduct and fabricated accusations meant to cast doubt on Marcus and Nina's credibility. It was a calculated attack, designed to wear them down and distract from the truth. But instead of breaking them, it only strengthened their resolve. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their home, Marcus turned to Nina, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," he said. "But no matter what they throw at us, we stick to the truth. That's how we win." Nina nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and love. "We'll win, Marcus. Because we're not just fighting for us. We're fighting for every family they've hurt. And that's something they can't take away." Their son stirred in his crib, his soft cries breaking the silence. Nina crossed the room, lifting him into her arms and rocking him gently. Marcus watched her, a sense of calm washing over him despite the storm they were facing. In that moment, he knew they would make it through. Together, they were unstoppable. The days that followed were a blur of calculated moves and emotional turbulence. Marcus worked late into the night, his office at home transformed into a war room filled with files, notes, and the names of every family Whitaker and his network had targeted. Each name felt like a weight on his chest, a reminder of what they were up against. Across the house, Nina moved quietly through the living room, cradling their son in her arms as she hummed a soft melody. The sound was soothing, a temporary balm against the storm they were weathering, but even in her quiet moments, her resolve remained unshaken. They weren't just fighting for their family, they were fighting for justice. That evening, Marcus received a call from his FBI contact, Agent Wilson, one of the few people he trusted entirely. The conversation was clipped and professional, but the tension in Wilson's voice was unmistakable. "Marcus, we've made progress," Wilson said, his tone cautious. We've identified several key players in Whitaker's network. 2 doctors, a hospital administrator, and a private adoption agency are directly implicated. But there's a problem. One of them has connections high up. If we move too soon, they could bury the evidence. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching as he processed the implications. So what are you saying? That we wait? Let them have more time to cover their tracks. Wilson hesitated, and Marcus could almost hear the man weighing his words. No, I'm saying we need to be strategic. If we go after them recklessly, we risk losing everything. We need more leverage, more witnesses willing to testify. Marcus ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion creeping into his voice. They're already trying to discredit us, Wilson. Every day we wait gives them more time to turn this around on us. We can't let them win. Wilson's voice softened, a note of understanding creeping in. I know this is personal, Marcus, but we have to play the long game. If we want to take them down for good, we have to be patient. Trust me, we'll get them. After ending the call, Marcus sat in silence, the weight of their situation pressing heavily on him. Nina entered the room, her eyes immediately locking onto his face. She could see the strain etched into every line of his expression, the way his shoulders sagged under the burden he carried. Without a word, she crossed the room and sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his knee. What did they say? She asked softly. Marcus exhaled deeply, his voice low and weary. They've made progress, but it's not enough. They need more time, more evidence. Meanwhile, Whitaker and his people are trying to spin this, trying to make us look like the villains. Nina's hand tightened on his knee, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. We knew they'd fight back, Marcus. People like them don't go down without a fight. But we're stronger than they are. We have the truth on our side, and we have each other. That's more than they'll ever have. Marcus turned to look at her, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. I don't know what I'd do without you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Nina smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You don't have to do it without me. We're in this together. The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected call from Harriet, the nurse who had first warned them about Whitaker's plans. Her voice was hurried, tinged with fear. Agent Bennett, I need to talk to you. It's important. Marcus's instincts immediately went on high alert. What's going on, Harriet? There's someone you need to meet, she said, her voice trembling. A mother. She's one of the families Whitaker targeted. She's scared, but she's willing to talk. I think her story could help your case. Marcus glanced at Nina, who was listening intently from across the room. Where can I find her? He asked. Harriet hesitated. She doesn't trust the hospital. She wants to meet somewhere neutral. There's a coffee shop on 5th and Main. Can you be there in an hour? Marcus agreed, and after a quick conversation with Nina, he left for the meeting. The coffee shop was small and unassuming, the kind of place where people came to blend into the background. Marcus scanned the room until he spotted Harriet sitting in a corner booth with a woman who looked like she was barely holding herself together. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, and she clutched her purse tightly as if it were a lifeline. Marcus approached the table slowly, his demeanor calm and non-threatening. Harriet, he said, nodding in greeting. He turned to the woman, his voice soft but firm. I'm Marcus Bennett. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. The woman hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. My name's Claire. Harriet said you're trying to stop him. Dr. Whitaker. Marcus nodded, pulling out a small notebook and pen. That's right. And we need your help. Whatever you can tell us could make a difference. Claire swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she clutched her cup of coffee. He took my daughter, she said, her voice breaking. Said I wasn't fit to be a mother. That she'd be better off with another family. I fought him, but he had the hospital backing him. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd call Child Protective Services. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have anyone to help me. Marcus's heart clenched as he listened, his mind racing with anger and determination. When was this? He asked gently. 2 years ago, Claire replied, tears streaming down her face. I've been trying to find her ever since, but it's like she disappeared. Every time I ask questions, they shut me down. Marcus reached across the table, his voice steady. We're going to find her, Claire. I promise you that. But I need you to tell me everything you remember, names, dates, anything that could help us build this case. As Claire began to recount her story, Marcus wrote furiously, his resolve hardening with every word. This wasn't just about Whitaker anymore. It was about the families he had torn apart, the lives he had destroyed. And as Marcus listened, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: justice wasn't just a goal. It was a necessity. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Marcus sat at the prosecution's table, his suit neatly pressed, his demeanor calm yet resolute. Beside him, Nina held his hand tightly, her grip a silent affirmation of their shared strength. Harriet sat a few rows behind them, along with Claire and several other families who had come forward in the weeks leading up to the trial. Their stories had created a domino effect, unraveling the tangled web of Whitaker's network and exposing the system that had protected him for so long. The weight of those stories, the faces of the children whose lives had been stolen, was etched into Marcus's expression as he prepared for the final battle. Whitaker entered moments later, flanked by his legal team. He was no longer the polished, confident man who had once exuded authority. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his actions had finally begun to crush him. He avoided eye contact with Marcus and Nina, his gaze fixed on the ground as he shuffled to his seat. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the gravity of the proceedings pressing down on everyone present. The trial had been grueling, each day filled with testimonies that painted an unflinching picture of Whitaker's crimes. Claire's testimony had been especially damning, her voice shaking as she recounted the day her daughter was taken from her, the threats Whitaker had made, and the helplessness she had felt. Other witnesses corroborated her story, detailing the systemic abuse of power that Whitaker and his associates had wielded for years. Marcus had worked tirelessly to ensure every piece of evidence was airtight, leaving no room for doubt or manipulation. As the final day of the trial began, the prosecution presented its closing arguments. Marcus listened intently, his gaze never leaving the jury as the prosecutor laid out the case with precision and clarity. When it was time for the defense to speak, Whitaker's attorney attempted to paint him as a well-meaning doctor whose methods had been misinterpreted. But the evidence was overwhelming, the voices of the victims too powerful to ignore. By the time the jury was dismissed to deliberate, there was little doubt about what the verdict would be. Hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom held its collective breath as the foreperson stood and delivered the words that would define the rest of Whitaker's life. Guilty on all counts. A ripple of relief swept through the room, followed by quiet sobs from the families who had waited so long for justice. Marcus felt Nina's hand tighten around his, and he turned to see tears streaming down her face. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe. The judge addressed Whitaker, her tone firm and unyielding. She sentenced him to the maximum penalty allowed by law, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But her words didn't stop there. She called out the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long, demanding accountability from those who had turned a blind eye. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Whitaker but for the entire system. After the sentencing, Marcus and Nina stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and cameras. Marcus spoke briefly, his voice steady as he thanked the families who had come forward, the Bureau for their unwavering support, and Harriet for her bravery in exposing the truth. But his final words were for those who had suffered in silence. This isn't just about one man, he said. It's about a system that allowed him to thrive. We owe it to every family he hurt to ensure this never happens again. And we will. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus turned to Nina, his expression softening. We did it, he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and pride. Nina smiled, her eyes shining with love and admiration. No, she replied, her tone gentle but firm. You did it. You fought for us, for every family. You never gave up, even when it felt impossible. You're the reason we're standing here today. Back at home, the atmosphere was lighter, the shadows that had loomed over them for so long finally beginning to lift. Their son slept peacefully in his crib, oblivious to the battle his parents had fought on his behalf. Marcus and Nina sat together in the living room, the weight of the past months slowly giving way to a sense of peace. They knew the fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still systems to dismantle and lives to rebuild. But for now, they allowed themselves a moment to rest, to breathe, and to hold on to the hard-won justice they had achieved. The story of Marcus and Nina is one of resilience, courage, and the unwavering power of truth. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice can prevail when we refuse to stay silent. For every family who has faced injustice, for every voice that has been silenced, this story is a testament to the strength that lies in standing together and fighting back. What did you take away from this story? How did it make you feel to see justice served, even in the face of such darkness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this powerful tale. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Here at Tales of Twist, we're committed to bringing you stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us all of the power of resilience. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.